The barbaric Hamas attack on October 7th, in which more than 1,200 people were brutally murdered and more than 250 taken hostage. 186 days and still 133 people, including 8 Americans, are being held hostage in Gaza. Many of the 133 are known to be dead, including 3 of the Americans. Some were murdered on October 7th and their bodies taken into Gaza. Some, known to be alive in captivity, have been murdered by their captors, like Eldad Getzir, whose body was recovered just last week in Khan Yunis. 186 days, more than 6 months. No indication of their medical status, no visits from the Red Cross, no word of when they might come home. For the families, 186 unbearable days of wondering if their loved one is dead or alive, is being tortured, or is a victim of sexual violence. 186 days is unconscionable. For many weeks, negotiations facilitated by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar have sought to achieve a ceasefire and bring hostages home. Israel has accepted the terms. Hamas has to date rejected them. The world waits for Hamas's response. As Secretary of State Antony Blinken noted earlier today, quote, "It is astounding to me that the world is almost defiantly silent when it comes to Hamas," end quote. So, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to once again bring urgent and necessary attention to the hostages still held in Gaza. All deserve to be named, but I will list the Americans, many of whose families are with us in the gallery here today. Idan Alexander, Sagi Dekelchen, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, Omer Nutra, Keith Siegel, Judy Weinstein and Gad Haggai, Itai Chen. My heart goes out to the families and friends of those hostages who have yet to be released, who have no information about the well-being of their loved ones, whether they are alive, injured, or dead. I refuse to let the hostages be forgotten. We must bring them home. Mr. Speaker, tonight with my colleagues, we stand on the House floor imploring Congress to work to save the hostages. We also honor the families of those who were killed or taken hostage on October 7th. Tonight, a number of these families present in the House gallery continue to call for our government to do all it can to bring the remaining hostages home, including Rachel Goldberg and John Poland, parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, a 23-year-old Chicago native who attended the Tribe of Nova Music Festival on October 7th. Jonathan Dekelchen, father of Sagi Dekelchen, a 35-year-old husband and father who was 200 yards from his kibbutz when Hamas terrorists invaded the area on October 7th. After sounding the alarm for his neighbors, he joined the kibbutz's security team to push back on Hamas. His mother was also taken captive but escaped when an IDF helicopter shot at the vehicle taking her away. Ronan and Orna Nutra, parents of Omer Nutra, a 21-year-old member of the IDF who was in a tank defending the Gaza border on October 7th. He grew up in New York and was living in Israel before attending university in the United States. Adi and Yael Alexander, parents of Idan Alexander, a 19-year-old member of the IDF who was stationed near Gaza at the time of the attack. Andrea Weinstein, sister of Judy Weinstein, who was killed on October 7th. Judy, age 70, grew up in Canada, but was born in New York. Liz Hirsch Naftali, the great aunt of 3-year-old Abigail, who was kidnapped alone to Gaza after her parents were murdered in front of her eyes by Hamas terrorists. We honor the memories of those who have died, and we pray for those who are still in captivity. I want to thank all my colleagues who have joined me here today as we work to make sure that we bring those hostages home. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material into the record on the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
Thank you. And it is now my privilege to invite my good friend, my colleague, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who joined me in Israel just 2 weeks ago on a mission to understand what Israel was going through and how we could make a difference.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for
his leadership in calling together all of us in support of bringing all of our hostages home and reminding the world that Hamas still has American hostages in its grip. We're joined tonight in the gallery by several of their family members who have spent every night for over half a year praying, mourning, hoping beyond hope for their loved ones' safe return. Our number one job as elected officials is providing for the safety, security, and integrity of the American people. We cannot rest while a terrorist group that has murdered Americans continues to hold Americans hostage. Nothing is more critical than what President Biden and his administration are doing every day. He is fighting tirelessly to bring Americans and the rest of the hostages home right now through a temporary ceasefire agreement. It is unconscionable that Hamas continues to reject a hostage deal and hold over 130 hostages in Gaza. It is despicable that these sick, violent fiends refuse to allow the hostages to be reunited with their families and cling like vultures to the remains of innocent civilians they have tortured, starved, and murdered in order to use them as political leverage. Our message to these families, our regional partners, and the American people is consistent and clear. Hamas must not succeed. The hostages must come home. 2 weeks ago, I joined my colleague from Illinois, and we both led, side by side, congressional delegations, I of women members of Congress, where we met with the parents of Hirsch Goldberg-Polin, who we have met with numerous times, and many of the family members that are here tonight. Rachel and John are here tonight as well, and their strength and commitment alongside all of the American families to be reunited with their loved ones is inspiring. The love of a parent knows no bounds. Once the hostages are released, we look forward to welcoming you all back to this chamber in celebration of your families being made whole again. Please know that I, personally and on behalf of my constituents, carry all of your loved ones in my heart each and every day. I'm proud President Biden and Vice President Harris have stood by Israel's side all of this time, defending the American and Israeli people and using leverage to push our allies and partners to get a deal done. There has been a deal on the table, and that continues to be negotiated today, spearheaded by President Biden, backed by Israel, Egypt, and Qatar, that will get hostages home, aid into Gaza, and a pause in the fighting. Hamas can end all the pain in hearts right here around us and in that region. If they had any interest in safeguarding Palestinians, this could all be over right now. Egypt, Qatar, and leaders with leverage must insist that Hamas accepts this deal. Anyone who wants to see a temporary ceasefire, the release of hostages, and a just and lasting peace must demand it of Hamas. It has been 186 days. Our fellow Americans must come home now. Those who have been lost must be brought home and laid to rest. And until that day, we will continue to stand together, arm in arm with these families and with our ally Israel. Thank you. Thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I inquire how much time remains?
1 minute remaining.
Great. Thank you. It is now my privilege to yield 3 minutes to my colleague, Mr. Barrett from Indiana. I am proud that support for Israel and the call for bringing the hostages home is something that we work together collaboratively on both sides of the aisle.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for yielding me this time. Hamas has committed countless acts of cruelty against the Israeli people since last year's unprovoked attack. Thousands lost their lives when Hamas stormed into Israel this past October to terrorize Jewish communities and brutalize their people. Many families have mourned the loss of loved ones, while others still live with the uncertainty of knowing their family members are held in captivity. I've had the opportunity to speak with the families of those hostages on multiple occasions, including some of those here tonight. I've stood shoulder to shoulder with them as they recount the terrible pain they've experienced, as they nervously await news of their loved ones. Despite the overwhelming grief these families have experienced, they continue to share their stories to shine a light on the true scale of Hamas's in humanity. I appreciate them for remaining in the spotlight to remind the world of the terrible atrocities committed by Hamas. Their courage is a testament to the strength of the Israeli people and all those who have been victimized by the Hamas terrorists. We will continue to fight for the release of all the hostages that are still held in captivity and stand with our friends in Israel in their struggle for their lasting security. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend who also traveled with us to Israel 2 weeks ago, the gentlelady from North Carolina, Kathy Manning.
Thank you to my good friend, Representative Schneider, for bringing us together tonight to push for the release of the hostages. It's been 6 months since Hamas terrorists invaded Israel to carry out gruesome attacks, raping, mutilating, slaughtering civilians, and taking innocent people hostage. Here we are 6 months later, and 130 hostages remain captive in Gaza. I recently returned from a congressional delegation trip to Israel. I saw firsthand the savage and diabolical nature of the October 7th attack. I visited Kibbutz Kfar Aza, one of the communities that was burned and pillaged. I saw the devastating destruction that resulted when Hamas went house to house, killing people by throwing grenades in their homes, spraying them with bullets, and setting their homes on fire while young people were hiding inside. The deliberate cruelty was shocking, gut-wrenching, and unforgettable. Kibbutz Kfar Aza is where Aviva and Keith Siegel were taken by Hamas. Keith Siegel is an American citizen from my home state of North Carolina. For 6 months, Keith has been held hostage by these terrorists. I think about Keith and all the hostages every single day. Aviva spent 51 days in captivity, and thankfully she was released in November, and since her release, she has spoken out about the horrifying sexual abuse and violence she saw Hamas use on the hostages. It's hard to imagine what the women still being held captive today must be experiencing, and it's hard to anticipate the condition they will be in when they are finally returned. For the young women who are being raped and tortured, I am deeply worried that they will be pregnant as a result of their rapes in captivity. During my visit to Israel, I met with Dr. Kohav El-Kayam Levy, the chair of Israel's Civil Commission on October 7th crimes by Hamas against women and families. She is working tirelessly to gather testimony and the evidence of the sexual abuse of women and families. And she says the job of viewing and archiving the evidence is particularly tough on her staff. So are the death threats they get from people who don't want to see the evidence of those horrific crimes collected for the world to see. The accounts of sexual violence she shared can only be described as evil, carried out to inflict maximum physical, emotional, and psychological pain on women and girls. We cannot allow the world to ignore what has happened, and we cannot allow the world to forget the hostages. And the world cannot be allowed to ignore the truth that Hamas has the power to end the war they started by releasing the remaining hostages. Time and time again, Hamas has refused ceasefire deals and refused to release the hostages. It is shocking that the world is not protesting Hamas, calling out Hamas for starting this war and continuing it, hiding behind women and children and prolonging the suffering of two peoples. So let me be clear. Hamas must release the hostages and stop all the suffering they have caused and are continuing to cause. Thank you again to my dear friend, Representative Schneider, for your leadership, for organizing this time together for us to continue to call out for every single hostage to be brought home.
Thank you. It is now my privilege to yield 3 minutes to another one of our colleagues who joined us on that trip 2 weeks ago from California, Norma Torres.
Thank you to my colleague, Mr. Speaker. I also rise to demand the immediate release and safe return of the remaining hostages in Gaza, who have now spent half a year in captivity. The words of a mother, I love you, stay strong, survive. This is the mental message Rachel Goldberg Poland sends her son Hirsch every single day. He's an American who is among the 130 hostages still held captive by terrorist Hamas for 186 days. The 130 hostages are not mere numbers, they are people with stories and families who love them and desperately want to see them home. 3 of these hostages are American citizens. Hirsch Goldberg is a vibrant 23-year-old California native who loves soccer, traveling and spending time with his family and friends. He fought for unity and equality in Israel as a leader of an initiative to bring Israeli and Palestinian children together through soccer. I spoke with his mother, his parents, who are with us tonight in Israel last month. They are in a constant state of profound trauma, not knowing whether their son is dead or alive, not knowing if their son will ever come home. All they know about their child is that their child came from survivor accounts and from watching terrorist Hamas GoPro footage of the October 7th massacre. Hirsch was last seen on October 7th with his left arm blown off by terrorist Hamas grenades, and his body was loaded into a truck heading into Gaza at gunpoint. His last messages to his parents read, I love you, I'm sorry. Despite the horrifying images, Hirsch's mother, Rachel, says that hope is mandatory. Mr. Speaker, here in Congress, hope is not enough. I join my colleagues in calling for the immediate release of all hostages held by Hamas terrorists, and I urge the administration to continue to do everything in its power to help free the hostages like Hirsch and ensure their safe return. I will not allow the hostages to be forgotten. They are not a terrorist group, political pawn, and I stand with their families in calling for an immediate return, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last week there were 19 members of the Republican freshman class who were in Israel. I'm pleased to yield time to one of those 19 members, Rudy Yakum from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to continue to call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Hamas committed unspeakable war crimes 186 days ago on October 7th. Since that day, we have borne witness to stories of the atrocities committed by Hamas from survivors of the attack and from hostages who have been released. Last week, I traveled to Israel and saw the aftermath of Hamas's slaughter. We witnessed firsthand in kibbutz Nir Oz, which prior to Hamas's attack had 400 residents. In that kibbutz, we walked through homes where men, women, children, and elderly were murdered or taken hostage. It is estimated that 25% of Nir Oz's residents were either killed or abducted and taken hostage by Hamas. Hamas showed utter disregard for human life. I also met with Rachel Goldberg and John Pollan, whose American-Israeli son Hirsch was taken hostage by Hamas. Hirsch remains in captivity today. I am grateful that Rachel and John are here tonight, along with several other families whose loved ones are being held in Gaza. I admire your strength, especially in a time of such immense hardship. Know that your loved ones are not forgotten. We must continue to call for the release of every last hostage until they have all come home. The fastest way for this conflict to end is for Hamas to release every hostage and surrender. It is past time to bring them all home. I thank my good friend, the gentleman from Illinois, Brad Schneider, for organizing tonight's special order. Thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce from the state of Massachusetts, my friend Jake Auchincloss.
Today we stand against anti-Semitism and in solidarity with the hostages and their families. We stand together against the depravity of Hamas, holding innocent men, women, and children hostage for 6 brutal months. We proclaim with one voice that the hostages must be returned immediately and unconditionally. We stand together against the surge in anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hate crimes. We proclaim with one voice that anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of Israel have no place in our country. My forebears in Ukraine learned through torment that hate may begin with solitary, anonymous acts of desecration, but it does not end there. Hate does not end unless we drag cowardly anti-Semitic actions into the daylight, bear witness as a community to their personal and penetrating effects, and resolve together that we are our neighbor's keeper. I am committed to all measures that will counter the scourge of anti-Semitism and that will hasten the return of the hostages. And we must all strive for an America that is true to its ideals and an Israel that is secure and democratic, where in both countries all sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and none shall make them afraid. I yield back.
Thank you. It is now my privilege to yield 4 minutes to my friend, the representative from New York, Dan Goldman.
Thank you to my friend from Illinois for scheduling this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time. I rise here tonight once again to lift up the 133 hostages, innocent babies, grandparents, young women who have suffered from awful sexual abuse, and so many others, who were all brutally and illegally captured on October 7th by Hamas, a terrorist organization which has held them in treacherous conditions for 6 months. We don't actually know how many are alive because Hamas has violated just about every single humanitarian law that exists and will not provide a basic list of those who are alive or even provide wellness checks and daily medication to the elderly. 8 of these hostages are Americans, 3 of whom are sadly now confirmed dead. 3 weeks ago, Itai Chen, a 19-year-old soldier in the IDF who was on the border of Gaza on October 7th, was determined to have been killed on that fateful day. Hagit and Ruby Chen, Itai's parents, and my constituents who are here tonight with several other families of hostages have fearlessly and courageously led the families of hostages to focus our attention on the urgent need to bring them home. But Ruby and the other hostage families should not have to work so hard to keep the hostages front of mind. Since when do Americans show indifference to 8 of our own held hostage by a terrorist group? Since when do international organizations and democratic countries around the world simply allow a terrorist group to hold hostages from 26 different countries captive for 6 months with deafening silence? Is it only because they are Jewish that they are viewed differently? We all want this conflict to end. We want the violence to stop. So let me give you 2 simple actions that can end this conflict immediately. First, Hamas can lay down their arms and relinquish control of the Gaza Strip. And second, and most importantly, Hamas must release all of the hostages, including the deceased bodies. That will end this today. There was a permanent ceasefire on October 7th when Hamas executed the worst terrorist attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas has vowed to repeat that attack over and over again if given the opportunity. Just imagine if after 9/11, Al-Qaeda controlled Mexico or Canada and vowed to continue to attack the United States from our own border again and again. Would a single person in this country have called for us to retreat and let Al-Qaeda remain in power next door, poised to replicate 9/11 again? Of course not. There are many calls for some kind of a ceasefire. And there's no question that some kind of ceasefire is long overdue, even though everyone seems to have a different understanding of the term. No question Israel must do its part. The Israeli government must increase humanitarian aid so that displaced Palestinians can get the food and medical care they need, and they have been doing that much more robustly since a conversation between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu last week. And the Israeli government must be willing to enter into a reasonable agreement to stop the violence and get the hostages out. But one requirement of any reasonable, rational ceasefire agreement must include that the innocent, tortured, illegally held hostages are released. I challenge anyone in this building, in my district in New York City, or in any of the 435 districts around this country to publicly say that a ceasefire agreement of any kind need not include the return of the illegally abducted hostages. But Israel has no control over the hostages. Hamas does. And so if any reasonable ceasefire agreement necessarily includes the return of hostages, and it must, then there can be no ceasefire agreement of any kind if Hamas is not a party to that agreement. So if you are calling for a ceasefire, then you must call on Hamas to release the hostages. And so I say to our administration, I say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of this Capitol, I say to our allies around the world, Hamas and the countries that harbor and communicate with their leadership must feel much greater pressure to release the hostages. More and more are dying every day. We must bring them home. We must bring them home now. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, is there any time remaining?
Has 1 minute remaining.
With your indulgence, I would like to read into the record the statement from our colleague from Maryland, Mr. Steny Hoyer. Mr. Speaker, I rise today